This was a very long title. Apparently, Consumerization of IT was cut off of that section of the title. But, just an idea. This is kind of what we're going to talk about. Kind of give a general idea. Someone was asking, is it a lot of concept? Is it, is it really high technical? It's really a lot of concepts, understanding risk, understanding mobility, tying all those things together. So here's a general idea of the agenda, where we deal with the consumerization of IT. We look at it from a broad stroke. We look at the impact of virtualization in that area very specifically, and then really how to shrink the change once you see the onslaught that's happening, and then understanding a little bit about desktop transformation, right? Just to be clear, I am a virtualization cloud strategist, so that's kind of what I do. I deal with virtual desktops, I deal with multiple different cloud reference architectures and so forth for both public sector, commercial sector, and so forth. But that's not fundamentally why we're here. Fundamentally, when you look at it, let's kind of take a little step back and look towards where we're at, right? The information age is kind of the age that we're in today. And the industrial age was the age that was before us, and that industrial age had a great worker that was called the blue-collar worker. Right? And so we built many things for that type of conversation between unions and all kinds of other scenarios. Today, we're in the information age, and the information age has that same singular type person, and that is the knowledge worker. And the knowledge worker is, from Drucker's principle, if you will, a person who can transform the information or intellectual things that we gather in our heads, transform it into a product or a piece of work or a piece of information that we then continually use or we need to move forward with. Right? We're all knowledge workers to a certain degree. Right? But that knowledge worker has a landscape, and as that landscape evolves, you start seeing that there's certain levels of categorizations that you can actually attribute to that knowledge worker landscape. Now, a lot of times, you're looking at both tasks, remote workers, office workers, guest workers, and mobile workers, and most of the time you find that the office worker is no longer like the office worker that may be positioned in this picture. Actually, I was out at Facebook last week, and they're considered, most of them are considered office workers, except between building 16 and building 17 across the campus, right? People interact and move between these all the time, and of course there's about a couple of restaurants and things in between the 2 points, so they're still considered office workers, but they have a high level of mobility. Right? I'm pretty sure within your own environment and group, between the different buildings and organizations that you have to work with, your level of mobility is, of course, as great, if not greater. Right? And then you have guest workers, task workers, mobile workers who are generally mobile from movement. Right? And as you look at it, of course, the knowledge user workspace is changing as well. Right? As that knowledge user workspace changes, we start looking at iPads, we start looking at cell phones and tablets and so forth. And it starts bringing a certain level of epiphany together for you as you're starting to deal with it from both a security perspective and of course, moving forward out as a desktop application perspective. And that is that, most people today have 3 devices, if not 4, right? And personally, I think I got like 5 or 6 of them. But nonetheless, as you're starting to deal with BYOD and bring your own technology scenarios, people start having more. And as you start thinking about this in the old versus the new respect, in the old, I used to think about the 250 desktops that I had that I was managing to a certain degree. And then in the new, now that I see that there are over 3 different types of different devices that I'm helping and managing these people with, I'm really managing about 750 devices, and I've actually increased my level of risk and my level of security that needs to go up to a certain degree as well, because they could be anywhere. They could be doing anything, and pretty much they could be letting other people access it for any reason. Right? And as I said before, if you look at your current workplace scenario, about 50% of them are now mobile. Not necessarily just moving, in a car traveling or going out to the field, literally moving within the building itself. If you start dealing with a BYOT or iPads or BYOD type technology, they're moving within the building from desktop to the session, right? In a lot of situations. Of course, you have an increased growth in SaaS applications and the cloud type application scenario, right? My wife's the funniest person about this, is because my wife, being a consumer as she is, she probably uses 7 clouds as we deal with it today. Right? There's 7 different places where information about her is being stuck somewhere, and that, but it's natural, right? It's natural to them. They love it. It's the way they deal with life. And, in the enterprise, the corporate space, it's not exactly the same way, right? As well as you look at over 80% of the Fortune 500 are dealing with virtualization, or dealing with the virtualization to a certain degree. Okay? And it all starts off really as a philosophy, if you will. And this philosophy is really look at it from when the iPad was introduced, right? And I say this, I was talking to somebody earlier about this, is, when I grew up and I got out of school and I was going into the work field, the first thing I thought I should have in my work field is a laptop and a cell phone, right? A company had to provide me with that, right? Now, today, if the kid's getting out of college, he's not coming in looking for his laptop, he's coming in looking for his iPad, right? He's coming in looking for his Bluetooth and all the other pieces, because it's been a shift of focus, right? If you look at the analogy that I'm using here from the laptop, when I built this presentation, I needed a level of precision. So, of course, I did it on my laptop so I could be precise with where this image was at, and where that thing is at, and so forth. As you start looking at the landscape evolve, you start seeing, the smartphones. There's like 470 million smartphones out there, right? That people are utilizing in different respects and so forth. And these have now become a snack type item, right? An item in which I may not be able to do the PowerPoint on it, but I may be able to do my expenses on it, right? But in that same respect, as I let that device get onto my network, as I let that device gather data, as I let that device contain and hold data, it becomes a vulnerability and a risk in that perspective. But, I have to some degree, allow for the consumerization of IT to happen, or the productivity level that they all seem to be obtaining is going to be lost here at this particular juncture, right? Because somewhere, someone said, by the time you get back from lunch, if I can't get that email before that time, it just won't work, right? Life needs to move on in general. But then the third wave, the iPad, comes into play, and it's a dying item. It's an item in which, I can view a PowerPoint presentation on it, but I may not be able to transform or create one on an iPad, right? People do remediary ones and so forth, so on, but in the general sense, there's a large number of conversations that are happening from this level of consumerization, right? And sometimes they're counter-opposing forces, right? Sometimes, because I have an iPad, I believe that, having this self-service, being able to go up there and grab an application, pull it down on my machine and have it work instantly, should be the norm, right? And unfortunately, we know it's not the norm inside of enterprise applications, and usually not the norm in enterprise application space, right? And so as you're starting to look at these counter-opposing forces, how do you, determine and figure out where is the right move and where's the wrong move, and how do I make the right choices, right? You can take it from really 2 perspectives of the arena here, because the number one key thing that I've always seen is that the user, the application, is the most important thing, right? I've been dealing with virtualization so much that we used to come in and we consolidate servers in general, right? We're going to bring down these servers and so forth. And I always get a certain level of conversation with certain people going, you're going to get me out of a job, you're consolidating everything down. No, it's the people who are there because of the applications. They're there because of Outlook, or they're there because of Visio, or some application that's very specific, because that's really what they actually use. They really have no care about data centers in the back end. They really have no care that there's a SAN that runs all these pieces. They care about doing their job and their application. So, providing them access to their application is really what stands in the way. And depending on how I give them a level of access, based on the consumerization of IT, is all making the difference here very specifically. If I fall in on the right-hand side, right, of this equation, based on your perspective of looking, it's the hands-off side. It's the do-nothing side, right? If I do the do-nothing side, bad things can happen, right? But, you know, in that same place, you know, a lot of different capabilities are available to the end user, right? The end user comes in. I was out at a bank the other day, and, you know, just one of my friends does a lot of penetration testing as an example, and he does the old, you know, USBs in a box, goes in front of the front door, falls over, drops USBs, and walks off, right? And he sees exactly how many people walk into that building with the USBs that they think they're getting for free, and they go in there and they plug them into the machine, and boom, right? By 12 o'clock, he's got passwords, he's got usernames, he's got access to different scenarios, all because the person came in to the building, right? That level of understanding is the free Willy effect, if you will, right? Because there are no policies or controls in play, right? Whereas you go all the way to the other side, there's large level of policies and control. There's large levels of heavyweight mobile device management, is what MDM stands for, or multi-platform conversation. And in between, you have virtual desktops, because virtual desktops are actually a part of this equation on how I can get around this conversation altogether. Okay? Because there's a certain level of understanding over the sphere of influence and the sphere of control, right? And based on the sphere of influence and the sphere of control, this really starts playing out here, right? Here's our gap of reality, if you will, right? Lost, stolen device with proprietary data. If I don't take that risk under my consideration, if I don't take that piece under my control, then the ability that happens quite frequently really puts myself at a great disadvantage if I do not put some level of control on the personal phones that come into the location, right? I'm a bank as an example, right? And I'm actually, you know, has a person has a cell phone, what's stopping them from snapping a picture of a screen? Right? There's got to be certain levels of policies and conversations in there. And so as you lose further and further out of that sphere of control, that sphere of influence needs to be part of the conversation then next, right? If I look at configuration errors, which they happen quite often, right? And if I'm expecting the end user to be productive with that device, right? You know, I'm expecting him to be at lunch and answer the email back very quickly, and he's having levels of configuration error that are natural and normal in most environments, unless there's a level of control or management around it or policy around it, right? I can't effectively manage those. But if you look at the other side, where the severity and frequency, of course, are less, but the severity is much higher, right? I'm stuck out of those scenarios altogether. Right? So it's an interesting understanding of the paradigm shift, that you have to really look at the risk and the reward from the conversation, right? Having the ability to bring your own technology into the environment sets yourself up for understanding where you're putting yourself and your risk at based on the data and where the data belongs, right? So we'll talk a little bit about the impact of virtualization on that conversation, because virtualization, if I could, I would change out the word virtualization. I would replace it with the word delivery, right? Because technically that's all it is. It's a form of delivery to the end user, right? Form of delivery to an administration staff, form of delivery to a application owner, right? It's just a form of delivery. And if you look at some of these statistics that I went through and gathered up in the last 2 or 3 days, so I'd be pretty fresh with them, this 85% of North American companies are using virtualization, which is a fair assessment, because, you know, all of us use it to a certain degree, right? And then you look at that, 50% of those server workloads are virtualized as well. If you look in some of your current product conversations, the physical server number has decreased and the virtual server number has increased 5-fold, right? And it's going to consistently go that way because of, you know, the Gilder's Law, Moore's Law, Amdahl's Law, you name it, technology, that's where we're at. Because as you look at it, I can't go buy 486s anymore. And they come out with dual processors, quad processors, 15 processors. I don't necessarily want to put that out on the endpoint anymore, right? So there's a certain cost and weight around that. And then 70% of the virtualized servers are forecasted for 2014, as well as 40% of those virtual machines are going to be virtual desktops, right? And there's an inherent conversation that we're having here, not because of the capability of virtualization, but the actual complication of security. If you look at that 40% of virtual machines that will be now virtual desktops, I'm also saying that 40% of that traffic that would normally be outside underneath those corporate standards and corporate firewalls and security firewalls are no longer being advertised out on that network. They're advertised inside the virtualization bubble. Interaction between VMs is happening on a consistent basis that you can't see. Right? So therefore, how can you stop the threat? Right? There's certain conversations around a VM escape conversation. It's about 46% of the fears that most people have is that because I can log on to a virtual machine or a virtual desktop and I can see that the MAC address is a virtual desktop machine, I can actually take the VM tools that are based inside there and create an escape to the hypervisor and then compromise all the rest of the machines. Right? So there's conversations around virtualization because that's why 60% of the virtualized servers through 2012 are less secure than their physical counterparts. Because we're immature in a lot of the physical tool sets that we've grown and built up inside the virtualization so far. Right? But that doesn't stop innovation. That doesn't stop the change in the world. As you start seeing the change in the world, we start seeing changes in the mobile work styles, right? People working from home more often, people working from anywhere more often. Personally, I don't think that we should ever did that because somehow now I work 24 hours a day, but somewhere we should have been like, you know, we'll make the technology so it always shuts off at 5 or something like that, you know? But in that same sense, as that mobile work style is changing, the way that we deliver services needs to change as well. And that level of delivery, as I say, is synonymous with the level of virtualization in cloud, right? And that the way that we deliver it, it's going to have to fit that consumer-based conversation as well. Because as I said before, my wife, who now uses 7 clouds, right, is actually more advanced in the usage of cloud computing than most enterprises are. Because the traditional desktop has changed. The way that we look at the desktop has changed dramatically as well. Right? A lot of the things were hardwired onto one single device, and that was just the way it was. Now a lot of things are having the ability to separate. And that level of separation brings in a level of opportunity for virtualizations very specifically, and that virtualization allows me to compartmentalize a lot of the security threats that I'm looking at on a consistent basis. Right? So we'll take a little closer look at this conversation. As I said, from that traditional computing environment, hardware, OS, app, data, and user, all tied together, right? When somebody loses a laptop, the exposure was so great because everything was based on it, right? It was security numbers, there's Excel files, there's macros, there's all kinds of stuff was based on because it was all tied to the single traditional device, right? Start looking at the anatomy of the virtual desktop. The anatomy of the virtual desktop is entirely different because now I'm separating out that user conversation into profiles and folder redirections. I'm separating out the applications so that I'm actually doing application virtualization or session virtualization. I'm taking away the OS portion of the conversation, which that surface area alone, right, of the OS was greatly part of the compromising scenario that was in play, right? A OS can get a malware, an OS can get a virus, an OS can get multiple different things. What if I were to compartmentalize that particular piece of it and allow everything else to run on top very succinctly and never interact with each other? Right? But still provide a dynamic way for the user to get access to the things that they need to get access to. Right? If I actually did that, if I looked at it, I'm actually reducing costs by focusing on the persona separately, and I'm increasing flexibility by separating out a lot of the other moving components that are consistent. Right? Do I have a fear of Patch Tuesday anymore? Nah, because it's a hardened OS at that perspective. And it gets redone every time the machine gets rebooted, right? Nothing can affect it at the point because it's read-only, right? But all the other apps are on top doing the things that they want to actually do, and that personalization is still there, allowing me to do the things that I want to do. What is that really talking towards, to be very specific? It's talking towards moving from a device-dependent environment to a user-centric environment. It's talking about taking away the 750 devices that I'm managing and going back to the 250 people that I'm actually managing, right? Of course, there's cost associated to this conversation, right? As you're looking at BYOD and BYOT, and they're being brought into the environment, the thing that stands between the user and the application are now also these Microsoft-specific cost scenarios, right? If you're doing a Windows desktop, these are some of the cost scenarios you're going to have to deal with if you decide to let a single person have a single laptop come in and connect to a single application in your environment. Right? These are those type of scenarios that get in play. And as you're looking at that cost, right, and you're also looking at the level of risk because of where they're at and what they're doing, you're starting to see and starting to focus on the idea that I'm talking about, which is there's a lot out there. There's a lot of things that we have to deal with, and that this whole bring your iPad thing is not necessarily bad, but it's not necessarily good either. And it needs to be managed very carefully on how I actually allow my risk and my reward to actually work out. Right? Because the delivery options are very important, very specifically, because they can have a dramatic effect to the conversation. As I was specifying very specifically before, there's a level of virtualization at the application level, as an example, right? And that would be, let's say, here at the hosted VM desktop scenario, or at the hosted shared desktop scenario, where I'm doing thousands of users versus 150 users, right? Because I'm talking about these costs being multiplied and magnified based on the type of deployment I put out there for this conversation, right? So if I can deliver an application based on user categorization, then everything will be great. If I need to deliver a whole desktop, then it costs a little bit more, right? But depending on how I deliver it, that level of self-service and that level of conversation is really where you're needing to focus your particular strategies at on how I want to achieve that BYOT or understand that consumerization of IT, right? Because the on-demand apps is the key, right? It's coming down the pipe. My child knows how to go to Google and download his Angry Birds app and put it on his desktop and go about it. Try to explain to him what actually happens in the real world, right? He'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's just crazy. Really? You gotta go through all those? No. You just don't gotta, no, we don't. But this is the way that we really need to start moving towards, and you'll see the business will start evolving itself as that as well as extending onto physical desktops. But as I said, you know, as we're looking at it from the desktop transformation where it's all device-centric, very specifically, we really start needing to move towards people-centric. Any device, any place, any time, dynamic access, usage-based costing, right? And as I deal with this, somebody loses a laptop, I don't care, right? Somebody logs on to their grandma's PC, I don't care. I'm not leaving back any tracks anymore. I'm not tying myself to the desktop. I've released myself from that level of security conversation. Oh, and by the way, they're connecting. They're using an AES 256 communication string so that the communication between the 2 points is actually being secured as well, right? Oh, you want to do it on an Android smartphone? Great, right? That level of conversation helps to greatly reduce the level of risk that I'm associating with the consumerization of IT very specifically. Okay, but of course you can't just run out and do all this at once. So you have to figure out a way to shrink the change, bring the change with it, right? And how do you really deal with that? Of course, risk control strategies, right? Of course, we start use the back color, I guess, on that particular one. Avoidance, transference. You're looking at mitigation and acceptance, right? These are those risk controls that you're looking at on how I'm going to work specifically with BYOT, bring your own technology, or BYOD, right? Bring your own device, if you're familiar with that one versus BYOT, right? Because, you know, my father's always told me that two key things. The first one is learn from other people's mistakes, right? And I think this summarizes the key there is that weakness is the best teacher in this situation, because if you look at the security threats that you guys specifically as government have to deal with, right, on a consistent basis, it's staggering. And there's no consistent way to stop somebody else from building something new in a consistent manner, right? So you have to build an enclave, right? Your strategy should build an enclave strategy in which you think everything is a non-secure device and you play to that idea. And by providing that capability towards an application stream down to a non-secure device, keeping the application in an isolated environment so that you're managing the actual input and output of that application versus it being locally installed, locally executed, and locally managed, and which could be locally lost, right? There's a large scenario, and as I said, there's two things. And the second one that he told me was always that success is not knowing how close to failure, or failure is not knowing how close to success you are, right? And you know, we're so close to virtual desktops just about everywhere. How many people have ever heard of OnLive? You might see that yet? The service that they're doing virtual desktops out on, it's on the news, and playing video games through it and so forth now. It's that the consumer, once again, is getting to the point of using virtual desktops in a consistent manner, having the anywhere, any device conversation. Once again, they're going to be used to it at home. They need to have that same flexibility inside of the business, right? But there is a do-nothing approach, right? And that do-nothing approach, of course, can lead you into the right and can lead you in the wrong way, right? But I was doing this. How to address that level of evolution? It is to identify the right roles, right? Go through your environment and actually see, because you'll see a reduction in a lot of different scenarios, but identifying the roles based on the use case and the way that I can deliver these particular pieces out. My favorite conversation around virtual desktops was actually through a CSO who called me in, and not often do I get called by the CSO for a lot of these implementations. He goes, hey, you know, James, I need virtual desktop. And well, you know, what would spark this conversation from the chief security officer? He goes, oh look, he says, these are my intrusion detections over here in America. He says, these are the intrusion detections I'm dealing with in Europe. He says, these are the intrusion detections I'm dealing with in China. I need virtual desktops in China. No problem, totally understand. Because I can also set it so that it doesn't actually allow for the intellectual property to ever leave the data center, right? So that the knowledge transformation may happen at the endpoint, but it never leaves the data center, so I've never lost control of that intellectual property, right? And that was a very important conversation point specifically there around the virtual desktop scenario. So identify the role, how you would utilize it in the business case in that scenario, right? Define the applications. As I said, people come to work for applications, right? Facebook, right? My wife, I use her a lot in this situation, she'll throw her phone, right? The phone, a very important device because Facebook's not working. And I'm going, dude, it's just an app, right? It doesn't work for me either. I got dual processors on my phone. It's just an app. Let's not break the phone I'm gonna have to pay for later, right? But it's that, you know, she thinks that it's, you know, it's all happening there. It's not happening there. It has nothing to do with her. It has everything to do with everything else, right? But define the application and understand that piece very specifically. Discuss the endpoint. Now I know that sounds a little counterintuitive. What do you mean discuss the endpoint? You just said any device, anywhere. I agree totally. But it's also about cost and association to that. As I said, there's a situation in which I may want to deliver just an app, being an outlook, versus the whole desktop. Because if I can deliver the app is going to cost me, you know, 10 times less than delivering the whole desktop. Right? But having that level of flexibility, absolutely available. But definitely something you want to learn. And then enablement, right? Understanding the ability to empower the end user. We get into this conversation a lot of times from what I call the deployment tax. Okay? What the deployment tax is if in January I decided that if I bought Office 2010, that it would make my business 30% more productive. But I wasn't able to deploy it out until July to everybody, right? Can I really realize that I had 30% productivity that year, right? I really can't, because I didn't really get it deployed out until the bottom part of the year. So there's an understanding of how I empower the end user, right, to make the actual effective conversation work. Do I provide a self-service portal immediately, as an example, or do I, you know, taper it off through certain devices or certain movements, right? Because see, intuitively, IT has been working very strongly to down that total cost of ownership around that desktop. And they've been working it in the manner of which hardening, putting it in the right self-service, rationalizing it, but effectively making it dynamic to a certain degree, but really not to the full degree. Whereas today, because we're going user-centric, right? Because we need to really move that scenario, we've moved ourselves into the agility conversation where I'm adding the dynamic component to the actual managed desktop, still providing that same level of control, same level of policy capability, but now I've given it the ability to mitigate the risk by being able to compartmentalize and isolate the applications and the desktop very specifically. So, desktop transformation. Key thing that I've always learned, I read the book by Bill Gates, 1999, The Digital Life, right? It was a great book for that point in time. But the key thing that he said inside there that I always thought was great was that you need to change before change is required, right? You have to implement something that is going to allow you to gain the benefits from this in multiple dimensions, right? You can say, all right, I'm going to do BYOT diet, right? That's how I'm going to start off this. I'm going to create a policy for bringing in your cell phones, or I'm going to create a policy for how I'll be able to give access to you buying your own device, right? And then as you start moving up the curve, you'll start noticing that you'll be moving into levels of virtualization from mobile device management up through application virtualization, right? Because these have significant values. They've looked at application virtualization just as an example from the Office perspective. If you deploy it out Office through an app V characteristic, which is application virtualization, you'd save $82 per desktop, right? Just by deploying it out and that self-service capability in a way. Because you're not dealing with a lot of the configuration issues on the per snowflake basis, right? Because unfortunately, no matter what we do, how much we try to make those PCs exactly the same, every single time I've ever been anywhere and somebody has a PC, it is a complete snowflake because it's theirs. They've made it theirs, they put it there, and I want to give you the same capability, but I also want to make sure we're mitigating the risk, right? We're putting the right security parameters around it. So you could be BYOT light, in which, I want to do mobile device management, right? We have a customer right now who, people are bringing in iPads regardless of whether you want them or not, as an example. But you can also provide a guest wireless for them so that they can get on the internet. And on that guest wireless, I can implement an MDM policy. So now I have a level of mobile device management that says, hey, you're part of the environment, you get my free internet, great. You've got to give me the ability to remote wipe your environment in case you were to lose that iPad, right? Because this is very serious. I gotta specify this very specifically because my Xbox is a security hole right now. I don't know how many people use Xbox or play with their Xbox much, but you get Netflix, you get iTunes, you get on Amazon, right? And you log in, you only log in once, right? And then my son, he goes to GameStop and he trades in the Xbox, and I get a $150 bill off of Zoom not because I had some smart kid hacking something or other. They just didn't clean the Xbox before they gave it to the next kid, and the next kid was like, yeah, that game, right? There's these vulnerabilities that exist, and that the information on those mobile devices make that whole difference in that perspective, right? It wasn't anything that was in that nature. So moving up the stack, where you're looking at the any BYOT, right, where I want to have business, I want to actually gain the most I can from that BYOT initiative. It's about delivering a virtual desktop virtualization. It's about delivering that application out to the any device conversation. Okay? As I say, focus very specific on people-centric and use case driven. There are a lot of use cases around for virtualization, and as well, there's a conversation that, as you start virtualizing applications and as you start virtualizing desktops, you start extending your business out that much better and that greater because you're lowering the cost of the actual iceberg theory, right? The iceberg is, you're only seeing the tip on desktops a lot of times. And as you start reducing that iceberg, you're starting to actually have that control. This great starting point is the physical environment, right? Moving it out and doing it very specific. So in that desktop transformation model, we went through a distributed computing model, right? We went from centralized to distributed computing, and now we're moving on into cloud computing. But one of the key capabilities is that most of those have all been device-centric, right? All those models that we've been predicated upon have been device-centric very specifically. And this is an area where we're actually moving towards user-centric, right? Where the user is going to make the actual difference from where they are. And how I'm going to secure the environment is I'm going to secure the user, right? And to do that, I'll deliver, centrally delivered environments, right, down to session virtualization, app virtualization, desktop, until the point where it becomes optimally managed. And then at that perspective, it becomes a transformative service, right? And to do that, you'll also see a reduction in cost. And I'll give you an example of this conversation. So as I said, I do virtual desktops and cloud computing on a consistent basis. One of the customers that we have in the commercial space that deals with stores, if I'll be as layman as that, I come in, and it was 2009, and we said, hey, we're going to do virtual desktops. They liked the idea. They said, okay, do the study. I did the study, and I found that each desktop ran about $4,120, right, is what their average yearly cost for managing a desktop was. I said, well, cool. I've got this great virtualization. We've got virtual desktops. I can put them in. And I said, based on the current time period, being 2009, I could do a 30-to-1. Which meant I could actually bring down their environment and make it so that that $4,000 desktop was now only about $3,000. And they said, that is great, absolutely great, but we waste that $1,000 just trying to implement this type of environment because of the complexities and what you're asking and so forth. I said, totally great, totally cool. And there's still customers, still continue moving. And so in 2011, they call us back in and say, hey, we want you to do that study again. Well, most of the parameters hadn't changed on the actual desktop itself, so the structure of the $4,100 was still key. Except this time, because of Moore's Law, right, because it's now 12 processors and 24 cycles and, gobs of memory that's available, I was able to do a 90-to-1 comparison now, right? A 90-to-1 user density. That provided it at a $1,000 desktop versus a $3,000 desktop. And of course, that's when he's like, yeah, I want to do that, right? So now we've got thousands of desktops in this store capability and movement. Because there was a need, of course, to look at how do I get it to do this state right here? How do I bring that transformation model to actually give me that inclining or that declining cost in a consistent basis? We got a lot of things helping you out, and that is the hardware, the networking, the Amdahl's Law, Gilder's Law, and Moore's Law are all helping you to gain that capability. So, in summary, I want to say, make it people-centric, right? Make it understandable around use cases as you're starting to develop your strategy around BYOT and understanding the level of consumerization in your environment. Have an understanding that bandwidth is precious, right? Wherever, if a person is connected, a person is not connected, there's a different use case for that conversation, but it does not hold them out from using and having the same enforceable security policies in play. If I have a person who's offline who wants to run Office or Word offline, right? No problem. App virtualization, still a level of isolation. They can take that app and go with it, right? They go across the world in a lot of situations in time, come back, check the app back in, right? That's the licensing mechanism that would have created that scenario, right? Embrace consumer devices, right? Because unfortunately, there's going to be a new device that's going to come out tomorrow. Right? One of the coolest devices that are slated to come out in this month in 24 days. 24 days. Does anybody know what that device is by chance?
Surface.
Wait, what? You guys are actually catching up with that. All right, good. That's right, the Surface tablet. I believe the Surface tablet itself will be a change to the enterprise altogether. Now, you say that like, man, how can that happen? Well, this thing is you know, a lot of times when Microsoft comes into the actual arena, they'll be in the market and they'll be trying to catch up in the marketplace. And a lot of times there's one key thing that they do better than Apple in this situation, and that is make it a business device. Right, that's where they've made this major change for the Surface device, because the Surface device will actually consolidate two of those type of archetypes, right? A laptop and a thin tablet, right? Not just a conversion and it's able to convert and I'm able to get a piece of that. No, the key is that it comes in two flavors. It comes in an RT flavor, which allows it to be like an iPad or an iOS device, in which the apps won't interact with each other. They're just the regular apps. It's a Windows 8 device, but it's an RT version. And then there's an actual Pro version, which actually has an Intel processor, which actually comes with IE Pro on it, IE 8 or Windows 8 Pro on it. What does that mean very specifically? Now I can provide it the same domain policies that I have inside my enterprise today. I can put all the same applications, I can put all the same characteristics that I do today for my inside enterprise on that tablet, just naturally like it's part of it, right? They don't have that today, right? And you know, of course, ergonomically, the little kickstand and the keyboard make it work like a laptop so that you're able to actually have that level of immersion to that degree, right? Can't do that with an iPad today. Right, so it's an interesting paradigm shift that you'll start seeing happen when we start moving in that direction. Right, so secure by default. Right, as I said before, this is a technology conversation in which the security and the risks that are associated to this are based on isolation and encapsulation. Right, using virtualization as a delivery mechanism to subvert malicious malware, to subvert other capabilities as far as code breaking and such. This provides that capability that you can't hack my channel, if you will, because I'm in a ICA session that's only sending you mouse clicks and screen updates. Right? You can't even piece together what I'm seeing on the other end, right? Because of this type of technology. So it's an interesting conversation and helps become a level of security to that degree. All right. Well, that's it for me, and that's it for my time. If there's any questions.
Can you get a copy of this, Jaymes?
Absolutely. And then if you look at the copy, I actually put a couple of things in down below, which give you an understanding of the type of architectures there are. And I also have an idea around the multidimensional. So this is definitely some additional pieces that you guys may want to take a look at during the end of the actual presentation. I will send a copy to you guys. I think they're going to send them out just in nature, but if you will hand me your card, I'll make sure you personally get it. Okay.
You mentioned virtual machine and virtual desktop are the same.
That's a great question. Now, technically, they're the same. Okay? But to be clear, and this is an epiphany conversation, people today have been dealing with server virtualization. Okay? And virtualizing a server is great. I've taken companies that had 600 servers and virtualized them down to 21. Right? Great scenario. Okay? But it's still an admin and it's still a server function. Okay? The way that I've been building that virtualization environment for that particular piece has been also based on server functions, okay, for the VM. When you actually take a look at it and you say, okay, you know what, I want to do virtual desktop virtualization. Now, it does use a VM, but it's an entirely different conversation because there's a person on the other end of that, right? See, in virtual desktops today, an actual person is going to be upset when their mouse is not moving as fast as they think it should be. Whereas in server consolidation world, mouse doesn't move fast, I'll just go on to the next machine, right? The virtual desktop infrastructure, after you looked at it, a large penetration of virtualization is approximately 600 to 700 machines. A higher one is 1,000 plus machines, right? But your average starting virtual desktop environment starts about 500 machines and grows a little bigger because there are consequently more desktops than there are servers in any company. And so if I actually try to virtualize all the desktops that are in that company, I'm going to outclass the servers by 2/3 easily. So a virtual desktop environment still uses a VM, but a virtual desktop is an entirely different conversation because there's certain security capabilities and things that I'm going to put around that virtual desktop that I don't have to do for a virtual machine that is a server virtual machine.
You said something about licensing. I know you.
Flip that up. So there's a licensing conversation. I remember.
A user is a user. A user license is still a user license.
No.
So how does that save me money?
No. I will get back to that spot right there. So
here's the Microsoft Moneymaking conversation. All right, it's that if I have my regular, so in a lot of companies, I buy a desktop, right? Most likely I have an OEM license on it, okay, which is non-transferable into a virtual desktop. Okay, so let's start there. So there I'm going to buy a new virtual desktop. Okay, so I put it in on the hypervisor, buy the new OS, put it in on the hypervisor. Now it's sent. Unfortunately, I want to connect to that virtual desktop. Well, that requires a VDA. Okay, that VDA, depending on the type of device you're connecting from, could cost you upwards of $90 or to $120 if you're using a Linux type device versus a Microsoft embedded device. You see this Office device license, right? So that's Office. So I got Office on that desktop, but I want to use it at home. I want to be able to roam with that desktop, right? Even though technically there's nothing wrong with it, that's the cost that it's going to cost you if you don't have software insurance over that Office product, right? And these are outside of just my regular desktop, right? Because in a regular desktop, I have it, I can hold it, you're not going to charge me for viewing it and looking at it. This situation at VDA, I'm going to charge you if you come from this device, and that device separately, right? It makes a major difference in how I'm connecting to the devices from the virtual desktop, or whether, and the reason I didn't point this one out versus these two, this is the CAL license, right? You see that it's a definite cost of $62, and this is where I'm saying this is exemplified at, is that $62 one is this bubble, that $90 one is the 90 plus $340 one is this bubble. Okay, I can put Office on this one and not be charged that $300, $400 Windows license problem. Okay, and I can deliver it out to 400 people. If I want to deliver out Outlook as an example, I can deliver that out for $62 per person, right, on a consistent basis, versus over here, I'm doing it for $300 or $400 per person. And so the way that you deliver it is going to make a major differences in the conversation based on cost.
So hosted shared desktop is the only way that I can save money.
Well, that's money saving for sure, right?
What's a hosted shared desktop versus a virtual VDI desktop?
Great question. It is, there's two differences. I'm going to say down here at the appendix, I pointed out, so I'm just going to run down there and give it to you. There's two levels of technology. So you have your VDI architecture, which is looking very specifically at desktop VMs. It means they have their own OS, they have their own network isolation, they have their own processor capability. Very, very important conversation. Versus if I was in session virtualization, okay, which I can produce a Windows 7-like interface from a session virtualization, right, but it's not actually Windows 7. So therefore, if I had a person who came on Monday, okay, and there was like 10 of us that got together and we all jumped on this shared hosted machine, and one of us is an accountant and we use Excel and we're going to do macros because it's the end of the month, all the other ones of us that are on that same server, we're all going to suffer because that guy is taking up most of the CPU, most of the RAM. Whereas in a virtual desktop infrastructure, because everything is separated, you have your own processor, you have your own OS, you have your own memory, you coming in and you're the accountant, you go crazy, it's only going crazy on your machine, not going crazy on all the other machines, right? So there's a reason why you want to have that level of isolation. Another good example of that would be virtual graphics. Okay, virtual desktops that have graphical capabilities like AutoCAD and a couple other things, those right there would have a need to have independent processes and independent capability versus a shared desktop or shared capabilities.
Is there a trend one way or the other on the endpoint devices that they're using?
So no, the good part about that is that ICA is a actual a mediator of that conversation. ICA stands for the Independent Component Architecture. The way that I got into this game, actually, let's call it roughly about 14 years ago. I used to work at Citrix, and the way that I got into Citrix was that I was at a school district, and at this school district, we got all kinds of donations of 386s, 486s, and so forth. And what I did is I had mastered the ICA client onto a 3.5 floppy. Okay, so that client could basically run on any of these particular machine sets. The greatest part about it is that the ICA client, you stick it in, it boots up, and it communicates directly to the Citrix server that runs either the session virtualization I was just showing you or the virtual desktop. Okay, so technically, I'm going to date this conversation to a certain degree. I had 486s running Windows 2000 and Reader Rabbit, the most top of the line at that point on these 386s. And this was over 14,000 desktops, saving the school district, gobs of money and capability, because your ICA, it has the lowest capability. I mean, right now you can look at 76 different types of clients that this ICA can go on. My favorite one that I've actually put it on is, do you guys may or may not remember what a Sony Dreamcast is? Okay, you remember that guy? Well, it used to have a keyboard, and it ran Windows CE. And because it ran Windows CE, there was an ICA client for it. So I was actually able to do a full desktop on my Sony GameCube or my Sony Dreamcast. There's just a level of conversation around that.
But there's no trend where people that are going to virtual, they're buying a desktop with no OS, or they're buying the thin client?
So totally capable. Now, you're asking a question that usually we deal with in what I call the 50-50-50. Okay. So let's say you're a regular business. You probably got 50% of the people are ready to get brand new PCs because they're old. Okay. And there's another 50% of the people who are probably okay with their PC, and they probably go another year and a half in their PC. And then you got that other clientele that they just got brand new PCs and the hottest, latest, greatest. Okay, and this is when I say desktop virtualization is the major difference in this conversation. All these things, VDI stands for Virtual Desktop Infrastructure itself, whereas desktop virtualization by itself is very key and useful across all three of these models. So with an ICA client, I can either leverage the most brand new, fastest hardware by using what's called provisioning server and provision out that same desktop image and provisioning to the hosted environment directly to the hardware. Okay, so now it can run it. So now as that hardware, let's look at it from that stage of the life cycle. So as that hardware became decrepit or no, it's not going to be useful anymore, I moved that image into a server hosted image. But that endpoint that I just was using it in general is still viable as a hosted virtualization endpoint. Okay, and so that's another 7 years, right? When that guy dies, right, then I would replace him with a thin client at that perspective. Because then at that point, you've been in that hosted desktop, you've lived in that desktop all this point in time. Okay? So you can actually do it across all the gamut. Okay?
So you basically are pushing out like a R2, a 2008 R2 to look like Windows 7?
Yeah, so it has a...
What you're seeing.
Exactly. When you have a lot of times it comes down to user familiarity. And so instead of a server desktop, they give you the ability to make it look like a Windows 7 desktop. And so when you get your virtual desktop, even though it's on a shared session, it looks like a Windows 7 desktop.
On the server end, are you actually running this on top of hypervisor like VMware, or are you just running just the Windows with your software on top of it?
So both Hyper-V, right, comes with the ability, I don't know if you guys have seen Windows Server 2008 or 12 yet, but it comes innate with the ability to do RDS virtualization. So you can actually just take a Windows 8 machine, stick it on top of the Windows 12 server, and it will basically put itself on the hypervisor, and you can spin out multiple ones using differential disks, right? So from that perspective, it is a hypervisor. For the session virtualization, from that same example, does that from a role-based conversation. So same thing, doing the session virtualization, which is just the hypervisor or the machine on top of the hypervisor, if you will. If you look at it from a VMware perspective, you can, of course, load Citrix XenApp servers on top of VMware, and you can run it just like normal. Now, I will throw this out at you. The way that I personally and most of people in VMware or virtualization, the way that we came about it was through Citrix and those type of technologies, because what would happen is that Windows has a natural 2 gigabyte kernel, 2 gigabyte user space limit, right? Windows 2000, 2008 had this limit. And so when I use session virtualization, the end users are going in that 2 gigs of user virtualization space. Okay, well, that was getting a lot small because, you know, we were getting 12 gig machines, 15 gig, you know, these gigs were coming out, but we can't use any more of them to give more session loading. So virtualization became very key in this conversations, because I could create as many Citrix servers as I wanted, because there's no license on how many Citrix servers I can have, actually. There's only a license on the connection of Citrix, of the actual users. So I could literally create 4, 5, 10, 12 on that same host, that if I had normally just installed it directly on there, I wouldn't have been able to take advantage of all the memory in the OS, right? Because the OS would be the limiting factor. But instead, I created 10 of these same machines that are now getting 2 gigs apiece, so I'm getting more users out of that particular conversation automatically. So virtualization helped out a lot directly in that scenario for the session virtualization. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? No? All right, make sure, like I said, give me your card, and I'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation as well.